A fateful evening at Maple's Diner. The soft hum of fluorescent lights buzzed in the background as the sun set over the sleepy town of Ridgewood. The cozy diner at the corner of Maple and Willow was a staple in the small community, a place where stories were shared over cups of coffee, where friendships bloomed over late-night pancakes, and where strangers briefly felt at home. Its faded sign, though weathered, still hung proudly, offering comfort and warmth to all who entered. Melinda, the seasoned waitress who had worked at the diner for over 15 years, was wiping down a booth near the window as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the glass. In her mid-30s, with auburn hair tied into a neat bun and eyes that sparkled with kindness, Melinda had seen all walks of life pass through those doors. She had an intuitive ability to read people, a trait that came in handy in her line of work. It wasn't just about taking orders or bringing food. Melinda believed in making people feel seen. On this particular evening, the diner was quieter than usual, and the sound of the jukebox softly playing an old country tune added to the stillness. A couple sat in the corner, deep in conversation, while an elderly man quietly read the local paper at the counter. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until the bell above the door chimed, and a family of 3 walked in. Melinda turned to greet them, as she always did, with a smile. "Good evening, folks. Welcome to Maple's Diner. Grab a seat wherever you like, and I'll be right with you." The family consisted of a man, a woman, and a boy who looked no older than 10. The parents seemed tired, their faces drawn with the weariness of life, but it was the boy who caught Melinda's attention. He was small for his age, with messy dark hair that fell into his eyes. There was a certain stillness about him that made Melinda pause. Unlike most children, who bounced with energy or excitement, he seemed too quiet. His posture was rigid, and he kept his eyes downcast, his hands folded tightly in his lap. As Melinda approached their table, she took a quick glance at the boy's arms. Her breath hitched. Bruises, dark, purple marks, peeked out from under the sleeve of his long-sleeved shirt. They weren't fresh, but they were unmistakable. Melinda's heart sank. She had seen bruises like that before, on children, on women, on people who tried to hide their pain behind smiles or silence. "Hi there, what can I get you all tonight?" she asked, her tone warm but her mind racing. She needed to stay calm. She couldn't jump to conclusions. The parents ordered without much fanfare: coffee, a burger, fries. But the boy stayed silent, staring at the laminated menu as if it were the most fascinating thing in the world. When it came time for him to speak, he only glanced up at his father, who gave a slight nod. "I'll have a grilled cheese," the boy said softly. His voice was barely above a whisper. Melinda couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She had served hundreds of families over the years, but there was something in the way this boy interacted with his parents, or rather, didn't interact, that made her uneasy. His mother avoided eye contact, focusing on her phone, while his father seemed too controlling, too sharp in his movements. As she jotted down their order and turned to leave, she caught the boy's eyes for the briefest of moments. They were wide, filled with something she couldn't quite place. Fear, sadness, desperation. Melinda returned to the counter, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had just witnessed. She couldn't shake the image of those bruises or the haunted look in the boy's eyes. She had seen families in distress before, but something about this situation felt different, urgent, dangerous. Over the years, she had learned to trust her gut instincts, and right now, they were screaming at her. But what could she do? She didn't have proof, just a gnawing feeling in the pit of her stomach. As she handed the order slip to the cook, Melinda's mind raced with questions. Was the boy being abused? Were his parents responsible? And if so, what could she do to help without making things worse? She had heard stories, awful stories, about children slipping through the cracks, their cries for help going unheard, because no one wanted to get involved. Melinda couldn't live with herself if that were to happen here. But the situation was delicate. She had to be careful. The family's food was ready in no time, And as Melinda brought the plates to their table, she tried to engage the boy in conversation. "So, how's school going?" she asked brightly, placing the grilled cheese in front of him. The boy shrugged, not looking up from his plate. "Do you have a favorite subject?" she pressed gently. Again, no answer. His father shot her a warning glance, and Melinda backed off, sensing she had overstepped. But as she turned to walk away, she felt a small tug on her apron. It was the boy. He looked up at her with those same wide, pleading eyes, and whispered, "Please help me." The words were so quiet that for a moment, Melinda thought she had imagined them. But the look in his eyes told her otherwise. Her heart raced as she glanced at the parents, who were too engrossed in their own conversation to notice. Melinda knelt down, pretending to adjust her shoe, and whispered back, "I'm going to help you, I promise. Just stay calm." The boy nodded, his eyes watering with relief. Melinda's mind whirled as she stood up and walked back to the counter. She needed to act fast, but carefully. If she alerted the parents that she was onto them, the boy could be in even greater danger. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. There had to be a way to get the boy out of this situation without causing a scene. But how? Melinda grabbed her phone from her apron pocket and discreetly dialed 911, keeping the phone hidden under the counter. When the operator picked up, she spoke in code, pretending to be calling in a supply order. "Hi, I need to place an order for extra napkins and ketchup." "Yes, a lot of ketchup. Actually, can you send someone to pick it up? We need it delivered as soon as possible." The operator hesitated, but then seemed to catch on. "Got it, ma'am. Help is on the way." Melinda hung up, her heart pounding in her chest. All she had to do now was keep the family there long enough for help to arrive. As the minutes ticked by, Melinda kept an eye on the family, her pulse racing with every passing second. Would they notice? Would they try to leave? What if they took the boy with them before help could arrive? But then, the door chimed again, and in walked a police officer, his presence commanding yet calm. He made a beeline for Melinda at the counter, his expression serious but reassuring. Melinda took a deep breath, knowing that whatever happened next, she had done the right thing. But as the officer approached the table, tension crackled in the air. Whatever the boy had been hiding, it was about to come to light. Unveiling the truth. As Officer Daniel Vargas stepped into Maple's diner, he immediately sensed something was off. The familiar warmth of the place, a haven for many in Ridgewood, seemed tainted tonight. The subtle tension that clung to the air wasn't lost on him. As a local cop, Vargas had been called to all kinds of situations over the years, but it was the ones involving kids that always hit hardest. He had kids of his own, and his protective instincts kicked in the moment he saw the quiet boy sitting with his parents at the far end of the diner. Melinda, the waitress he had come to know well from his years of grabbing coffee and pie at Maple's, gave him a nod from behind the counter. She looked tense, her usual sunny disposition clouded with worry. That was the first sign. Melinda was not the type to overreact, so whatever had prompted her to make the call must have been serious. As Vargas approached the table, he kept his tone light but authoritative. "Good evening, folks. I'm Officer Vargas with the Ridgewood PD. Mind if I have a word?" The boy's father stiffened immediately, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at his wife, who looked just as startled. The boy, however, remained as still as a statue, staring down at his plate, avoiding all eye contact. The father cleared his throat, his voice sharp. "What's this about, officer? We're just trying to have dinner." Vargas didn't miss the edge in his voice, nor the way the man's hand hovered protectively over the table, as if preparing to grab the boy. The mother stayed silent, her gaze fixed on her phone, though her hand trembled slightly. It was clear that this family wasn't just having dinner. There was something darker going on beneath the surface. "I'm just doing a routine check," Vargas replied calmly, meeting the father's glare with a steady gaze. "I'd like to speak with your son for a moment. Is that all right?" The father's jaw clenched, his eyes cold. I don't see why that's necessary. My son's fine. We don't need any trouble here. Vargas didn't flinch. He had dealt with men like this before, men who tried to exert control over everything around them. But it wasn't the father that concerned him most. It was the boy. Isaiah, according to the name Melinda had quietly whispered to him when he entered the diner. Vargas shifted his attention to Isaiah, whose small hands fidgeted with the hem of his sleeve. The bruises, now that he was closer, were even more evident. Dark, circular marks, like old battle scars, dotted the boy's forearms, just barely visible beneath the fabric. His heart sank. "Isaiah, can you step outside with me for just a minute?" Vargas asked, keeping his tone gentle, as though he were speaking to one of his own kids. "I just want to make sure everything's all right." For a moment, there was silence. Isaiah didn't move, didn't lift his head. But then, slowly, he raised his gaze to meet Vargas. There was something haunting in those eyes, a deep, silent plea for help that words couldn't express. In that split second, Vargas saw everything he needed to know. The boy didn't need to speak. His eyes said it all. Before Isaiah could respond, his father slammed his hand down on the table, the sudden bang startling everyone in the diner. "We're not going anywhere," he barked, his voice rising. "This is ridiculous. I'm not letting some cop talk to my kid without me present." Vargas stayed calm, but the tension in the room had reached a boiling point. Other patrons were beginning to notice the commotion, whispering amongst themselves, unsure whether to intervene or leave. But Vargas wasn't about to back down, not with a child's safety on the line. "Sir," he said firmly, locking eyes with the father, "I need you to step outside with me as well. We can clear this up quickly if you cooperate, but I will be speaking with your son. Either you can make this easy or you can make it difficult. Your choice." The father's face flushed red with anger. But before he could say anything further, the mother, silent until now, finally spoke up. "Just let him go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She glanced at her husband, her expression pleading. "It's just a few minutes. Let Isaiah talk to him. We've got nothing to hide." The father's eyes flicked toward her, fury flashing in his gaze, but he didn't respond. For a brief moment, Vargas wondered if the mother was also a victim, silent, complicit out of fear, trapped in a situation beyond her control. She didn't seem the type to stand up to her husband, not with the way her hands shook as she folded them in her lap. Isaiah finally slid out of the booth, his movements slow, as though he were bracing himself for something. Vargas nodded reassuringly at him as they made their way to the front door. He noticed that the father stayed seated, watching them like a hawk, but he didn't move. Maybe the man thought better of causing a bigger scene in a public place, or maybe he had something to hide. Once they were outside, the cool evening air hit Isaiah's face, and for the first time since Vargas had arrived, the boy seemed to relax. If only a little. Vargas knelt down to Isaiah's eye level, trying to make himself less intimidating. "Isaiah," Vargas began softly, "you're not in trouble. I just want to know if everything's okay. Can you tell me if something's wrong? You don't have to be afraid." Isaiah's lips trembled, but he said nothing. His small body seemed to shrink under the weight of the question, as if the words he wanted to say were trapped, fighting to break free. But then his hands, those bruised, trembling hands, reached up and pulled back the sleeve of his shirt, revealing the full extent of the damage. Bruises, deep and varied in color, snaked up his arm, some older than others. It was worse than Vargas had anticipated. Vargas felt a tight knot form in his chest. "Who did this to you, Isaiah?" he asked gently. Isaiah hesitated, his eyes darting toward the diner's window, where his parents were still seated. His voice, when he finally spoke, was barely a whisper. "My dad," he said, his voice trembling with fear and shame. Vargas closed his eyes for a moment, trying to suppress the anger that bubbled inside him. This was exactly what he had feared. He had seen this too many times. Children hiding their pain, covering up for the people who were supposed to protect them. Does it happen a lot? Vargas asked, already dreading the answer. Isaiah nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. Almost every day, he whispered. He says I'm bad. That I make him angry. But I try. I try to be good. Vargas's heart broke at those words. No child should ever feel responsible for their own abuse. He gently placed a hand on Isaiah's shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. Isaiah, listen to me. This is not your fault. None of it. Do you understand? The boy wiped at his tears, nodding shakily, but Vargas could see the doubt still lingering in his eyes. Years of abuse had conditioned Isaiah to believe the lies his father had fed him. It was going to take time, maybe a lifetime, to undo that damage. But first, Vargas had to get him to safety. I'm going to help you, Vargas promised. I'm going to make sure you're safe, but I need to ask you something important, okay? Isaiah looked up, his expression fearful but trusting. Okay, he whispered. Is your sister in danger too? Vargas asked, referring to the little girl who had stayed so quiet at the table, almost blending into the background. Isaiah's face paled, and he bit his lip, his gaze dropping to the ground. After a long pause, he whispered, yes, sometimes. Vargas felt the weight of the situation crash down on him. This wasn't just about Isaiah. It was about his sister too. Both children were in danger, and now it was clear that the father's anger extended beyond Isaiah. I'll make sure she's safe too, Vargas said, standing up. I'm going to need to take you both somewhere safe tonight, all right? You're not going back with them. Isaiah's eyes widened in a mix of fear and relief. Will Dad get mad? Vargas shook his head. You don't need to worry about him anymore. We'll take care of it. You're going to be okay, Isaiah. Isaiah took a deep breath, nodding again, though the fear still clung to him like a shadow. He had lived so long in terror that the idea of safety felt foreign, almost impossible. Vargas gently guided him back toward the diner's entrance. But as they approached, Vargas noticed something that made his blood run cold. The father was gone. The search for safety. Isaiah's father had disappeared. Officer Vargas scanned the diner with a sharp eye, his senses on high alert. The man's absence sent a jolt of fear coursing through him, tightening his gut. A situation that had been tenuous was now teetering on the edge of something far more dangerous. People like Isaiah's father didn't just walk away calmly. They ran when they felt cornered, and they often didn't run alone. Melinda, still standing behind the counter, caught his glance, her brow furrowed in worry. The mother sat in the booth, staring down at the empty seat where her husband had been moments before, as if unable to process the sudden shift. Isaiah's little sister, a girl no older than 5, clung to her mother's side, wide-eyed and silent, her thumb tucked into her mouth. The tension was palpable. Vargas guided Isaiah back into the diner, keeping a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. He approached the mother cautiously, his eyes flicking to the door, wondering if the father was still nearby, or if he had already vanished into the night. "Ma'am," Vargas said gently but firmly, "where did your husband go?" The woman looked up at him, her face pale and drawn. She glanced out the window and then at her daughter before whispering, "I don't know. He just got up and left. He does that sometimes." Isaiah, still standing beside Vargas, tensed at her words. He knew what that meant. When his father left unexpectedly, it wasn't just to cool off. There was always something more sinister behind those exits. "Ma'am, I need you to listen to me carefully," Vargas said, his voice lowering. "Your husband's behavior is concerning, and based on what your son has told me, I'm going to have to take both of your children into protective custody tonight. This is for their safety. You can come with us if you want, but they aren't going home with him." The woman blinked, her lips parting in disbelief. She looked at Isaiah, then at her daughter, and back to Vargas, as if struggling to grasp the reality of the situation. "But protective custody? Are you saying they're in danger?" Vargas gave a small, grim nod. "Yes, ma'am. I'm afraid your husband has been harming your son, and I need to make sure both of your kids are safe from him. Right now, my priority is getting them out of here before he comes back." Tears welled up in the woman's eyes, and she hugged her daughter tightly, whispering something into the little girl's ear. Her hands trembled as she spoke, but there was a resigned, broken quality to her movements. It was as if she had known this day would come, but had always hoped it wouldn't. The truth was finally out in the open, and there was no turning back now. Isaiah stood silently beside Vargas, his eyes flicking between his mother and the door. He had spent so long keeping his secrets hidden, protecting himself and his sister from the wrath of their father, that the sudden shift, this intervention, this rescue, felt surreal. Part of him was relieved, but another part was terrified. What would happen now? Where would they go? Would they ever be safe? Vargas knew time was running short. If the father had left because he suspected something, he could return any moment, more volatile and dangerous than before. Vargas had seen it happen too many times, abusers lashing out in desperation when they felt their control slipping away. Melinda, sensing the urgency of the moment, came over to the table, her usually bright eyes shadowed with concern. "Officer," she said softly, "is there anything I can do? Should I keep an eye out for him?" Vargas appreciated her offer, but he didn't want her to put herself in harm's way. "Thanks, Melinda, but I need you to stay inside, away from the windows. If he comes back, I don't want him seeing too much movement. He's unpredictable." Melinda nodded, though her hands fidgeted nervously with her apron. She had seen enough that evening to understand the gravity of the situation, and though her protective instincts were strong, she knew better than to intervene directly when things could spiral out of control. Vargas took a deep breath and turned back to the mother. "Do you have anywhere safe you can go tonight? Any family or friends who could take you in?" The woman hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. I don't know. My family lives out of state, and I haven't spoken to them in a while. I don't have many friends here. We've moved around so much. I've lost touch with people." That was the answer Vargas had feared. Abusive men like Isaiah's father often isolated their families, cutting them off from support networks, making it harder for them to leave. Without anyone to turn to, victims often felt trapped, with no choice but to stay. "You can come with us," Vargas offered. "I'll take you and your kids to a safe place tonight. There are shelters that can help, and we'll make sure your husband can't get near you." The woman looked up, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "But what about him? He'll come looking for us. He always does." Vargas nodded. "I know. But this time, we'll be ready. We'll get a restraining order in place, and we'll make sure he can't get close. I'll work with social services to make sure you and the kids are protected." Isaiah's mother closed her eyes for a moment, the weight of years of fear and uncertainty pressing down on her. Then, with a shaky breath, she opened them again and nodded. "Okay, we'll go with you." Vargas exhaled, relieved that she was willing to cooperate. But there was still the matter of the father. He hadn't seen him leave, and that worried him. Where had he gone? Was he watching from somewhere, waiting for his chance to strike? Vargas needed to get them out of here, and fast. "All right," Vargas said, stepping back slightly. "Gather your things, and we'll head out the back. I'll call for backup to keep an eye on the front in case your husband tries to come back." As Isaiah's mother began to gather her purse and jacket, the little girl clinging to her side, Vargas discreetly radioed in for backup. He described the father, providing details about the situation, and requested an extra patrol car to keep an eye on the diner's perimeter. There was no telling where the man had gone or what he was planning, but Vargas wasn't going to take any chances. Isaiah stood quietly by his mother's side, his small frame still tense with fear. Vargas crouched down next to him, trying to offer some reassurance. "Hey, Isaiah," he said gently. "I know this is scary, but you're doing great. We're going to get you and your sister somewhere safe, okay? You don't have to be afraid anymore." Isaiah glanced up at him, his eyes still filled with a mix of fear and uncertainty. "Will my dad go to jail?" he asked softly. Vargas hesitated, not wanting to make promises he couldn't keep. "That depends on a lot of things," he said carefully. "But we're going to do everything we can to make sure he can't hurt you or your sister again. You're safe with us." Isaiah nodded, but the weight of his past still hung heavy in the air. It was clear that years of living under his father's control had taken a toll on him, and it would take time for those wounds to heal. But for now, getting him and his family to safety was the first priority. As the mother stood up, clutching her daughter's hand, Vargas led them toward the back of the diner. The rear exit led to an alleyway, a quieter, safer route that would allow them to leave without drawing too much attention. The patrol car was already on its way, and Vargas knew they only had a few minutes to get out before the situation escalated. But just as they reached the back door, a loud crash echoed through the diner. The front door had been flung open with such force that the bell above it clanged loudly, the sound reverberating through the small space. Vargas whipped around just in time to see Isaiah's father storming back in, his face contorted with rage. He had a wild look in his eyes, his movements erratic, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. The other patrons in the diner froze, eyes wide in alarm, as the man took several steps toward the booth where his family had been sitting moments before. But when he saw the empty seats, his fury only intensified. "Where are they?" he bellowed, his voice booming. "Where did they go?" Vargas moved quickly, positioning himself between the man and the family. His hand instinctively went to the weapon on his belt, though he hoped it wouldn't come to that. "Sir, I need you to calm down," Vargas said, his voice firm but controlled. "Your family is leaving with me tonight. You need to let this happen." But Isaiah's father was beyond reasoning. His eyes darted wildly around the diner, searching for any sign of his wife and children. When he realized they were at the back, his expression darkened, and he lunged forward with terrifying speed. Vargas reacted instantly, stepping into the man's path, blocking him from getting any closer to the family. The father swung wildly, his fists aimed at Vargas' face, but Vargas was quicker. A fragile escape. Isaiah's mother stood frozen in the middle of the alleyway, her wide, tear-filled eyes locked on her husband, now restrained and pinned to the ground. The sight of him, once towering with authority and power, now broken and subdued by the officers, was almost too much for her to comprehend. For so long, he had been the one dictating every aspect of their lives, controlling her, controlling the children. Yet, in a matter of moments, the weight of years of fear and abuse had crumbled around them, leaving nothing but an eerie silence. Isaiah clung tightly to his mother's side, his small hand gripping her arm with a force that spoke of both fear and newfound hope. His little sister was still sobbing into their mother's jacket, her tiny frame shaking uncontrollably as the reality of what had just happened slowly seeped into her young mind. None of them moved, too stunned to process that the nightmare might finally be over. Vargas approached slowly, his hand still shaking slightly from the intensity of the confrontation, but his voice was calm, measured. He had been in situations like this before, domestic calls where the abuser would either turn violent or break down, their anger unraveling in dangerous ways. But this one felt different. There was something particularly fragile about this family, especially the mother, as if the last few minutes had completely shattered her, leaving her unsure of how to proceed. "Ma'am," Vargas said softly, keeping his distance to avoid startling her. "He's in custody now. You and your kids are safe, but we need to get you all out of here. It's not safe to stay." Isaiah's mother blinked as if coming out of a trance. Her gaze shifted from her husband to Vargas, and for a brief moment there was hesitation in her eyes. Years of control had conditioned her to seek his approval in everything, and even now, after everything that had just transpired, part of her was still grappling with whether or not she had the right to leave. "Where will we go?" she whispered, her voice shaky and distant, as if the words were coming from someone else. "What happens now?" Vargas stepped closer, glancing back at the other officers, who were busy securing Isaiah's father in the back of the patrol car. "We'll take you and the kids to a safe place for tonight. There's a shelter not far from here that specializes in helping families in your situation. They'll make sure you have a roof over your heads and people to talk to. After that, we'll work with social services to get a restraining order and make sure your husband can't come near you." The woman's lips trembled, and she looked down at Isaiah, her grip on his hand tightening. She had lived in fear for so long that the idea of safety felt foreign, almost impossible. Even as Vargas spoke, part of her was waiting for the other shoe to drop, for her husband to somehow escape the car and come after them, to remind her that she could never truly be free. "Will he come after us?" Isaiah asked suddenly, his voice small but laced with the same fear that had plagued his mother for years. He had heard Vargas's reassurances, but like his mother, he had lived under the shadow of his father's anger for too long to believe it would simply go away. Vargas knelt down to Isaiah's eye level, his expression softening. "No, Isaiah, he won't be able to hurt you or your sister anymore. We're going to make sure of that. And I promise, we'll do everything we can to keep you safe. You don't have to be afraid of him anymore." Isaiah's face was hard to read, his young mind struggling to make sense of the turmoil, to reconcile the fear he had lived with for so long with the idea that he could finally let it go. He didn't say anything more, but his gaze remained fixed on the patrol car, where his father sat, head down, subdued and cuffed. He wasn't sure if he believed Vargas, but he wanted to. More than anything, he wanted to feel safe. Melinda, still watching from the doorway of the diner, had followed the events with a pounding heart. She had seen and heard everything, her eyes glued to the unfolding chaos, unable to look away. Now that the immediate danger seemed to have passed, she felt an overwhelming need to comfort the family, especially the kids. As a waitress, she had met hundreds of families over the years, but Isaiah's haunted eyes and the bruises that told stories no child should ever have resonated with her deeply. She walked slowly into the alley, her footsteps quiet but deliberate. "Officer, do you think?" she started, hesitating as she looked at Vargas, unsure if she should interrupt. "Do you think it's okay if I help them? I know a few people who work at the shelter you mentioned. Maybe I could make a call, make sure they're taken care of when they get there." Vargas looked at her and nodded. "That would be great, Melinda. Anything to make the transition easier for them." Isaiah's mother turned to Melinda, her eyes wide with surprise. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know us." Melinda smiled softly, shaking her head. "I don't need to know you to want to help. What happened here tonight?" She trailed off, her voice faltering. "No one should have to go through that alone, especially not your kids. If I can do anything to make this easier, even just a little bit, then I want to." Isaiah's mother's lip quivered, and for the first time since the ordeal began, a tear slipped down her cheek. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Isaiah looked up at Melinda, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. He wasn't used to kindness from strangers. He wasn't used to anyone outside his immediate family paying attention to him, let alone caring about what happened to him. But Melinda's presence felt different, safe, in a way that he hadn't felt in a long time. The officers finished securing the scene, and soon a second patrol car arrived, ready to take the family to the shelter. Vargas walked over to the patrol car where Isaiah's father sat in the back seat, his face now a mask of quiet rage. The man hadn't spoken a word since being cuffed, but Vargas could feel the intensity of his anger simmering just beneath the surface. "You're done," Vargas said firmly, leaning into the window so that only the man could hear him. "You're not getting near them again. And if you try, you'll be back in here so fast, it'll make your head spin." Isaiah's father didn't respond, but the glare he shot Vargas was enough to communicate the depth of his hatred. He wasn't just angry at being arrested. He was angry at losing control, at the idea that his family had slipped away from him, beyond his reach. Vargas had seen this look before, the cold, calculated anger of a man who believed the world owed him something, who saw his family as possessions rather than people. Vargas straightened up, turning away from the patrol car. He had seen enough. As the family prepared to leave the diner, Melinda gently touched Isaiah's shoulder. "You're brave, you know that," she said softly, kneeling down beside him. "You did something tonight that a lot of people wouldn't have had the courage to do. You protected your sister, and that makes you a hero in my book." Isaiah stared at her, unsure how to respond. He had never thought of himself as brave, or strong, or anything like that. Most days, he felt small, powerless, like his world was spinning out of control, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. But hearing Melinda's words made him feel different. Maybe, just maybe, there was a part of him that could be strong. Maybe he didn't have to be afraid forever. "Thank you," Isaiah whispered, his voice barely audible. But in that moment, it was enough. As the patrol car pulled away, carrying Isaiah, his mother, and his sister to the shelter, Melinda stood in the alley for a long moment, watching them go. The night air was cold, biting against her skin, but her heart felt warm. She had done what she could. She had stepped in when it mattered, and now it was up to them to find their way forward. Vargas approached her, his face tired but relieved. "You did good tonight, Melinda. Really good." She smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I just did what anyone would do." But Vargas shook his head. "Not anyone. A lot of people would have looked the other way. You didn't." Melinda glanced down the empty alley, her thoughts drifting to Isaiah and his family. "I hope they'll be okay." "They will," Vargas assured her. "They've got a long road ahead of them, but they'll be all right. Thanks to you." Melinda nodded, but her mind was still heavy with the weight of what had just happened. She had witnessed something dark and terrifying tonight, but she had also seen a glimmer of hope. A young boy who, despite everything, had found the courage to ask for help. As she turned and headed back into the diner, the warmth of the night's events lingered with her. The road ahead for Isaiah and his family was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, they weren't walking it alone. And that, she thought, was worth everything. Rebuilding the pieces, Isaiah sat in the silence of the small shelter room, letting his mother's words sink in. Court felt like an ominous foreign word. He had seen it on TV, heard adults talk about it in hushed tones, but the idea that he would have to go there, sit in front of a judge and lawyers, and maybe even see his father again, was terrifying. The pit in his stomach grew heavier. His mother shifted slightly in her chair, pulling her knees closer to her chest. Her face was etched with exhaustion, but there was something else there, too. Relief, maybe. It was subtle, barely visible beneath the layers of fear and weariness. Isaiah had never seen her like this before. She had always been in survival mode, always on edge, navigating around his father's volatile moods like walking on eggshells. Now there was a stillness about her, a quiet that almost felt unnatural. "Isaiah," she whispered, breaking the silence again. "I know you're scared. I am too." Her voice trembled slightly. "But we're going to be okay. I promise you that." Isaiah wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that they were finally free, that they wouldn't have to live in fear anymore. But his mind was still tangled in memories, in the grip his father had held over their lives for so long. The bruises on his body still throbbed faintly, a cruel reminder that the damage wasn't just emotional. "Will he come after us?" Isaiah's voice was barely above a whisper, but the weight of the question was heavy. He didn't dare look at his mother as he spoke. She froze, her breath catching for a moment, then exhaled slowly. "No, he won't," she said, though there was a slight waver in her voice. "The officers said they would make sure he stays away. They're going to get us a restraining order, and he won't be able to come near us. If he tries, he'll go back to jail." Isaiah nodded, but the knot of fear in his chest didn't loosen. He had heard the promises from the police, but the idea of being free from his father's reach seemed too good to be true. His father had always found a way to control them, no matter what. A piece of paper couldn't stop the nightmares, couldn't stop the lingering fear that gripped him every time he thought about his father's anger. The shelter staff had been kind, offering them food, clothes, and a place to rest. The room was small, but it was warm and safe, far from the chaos of the night before. It felt like a temporary refuge, a place to hide from the world while they figured out what came next. Isaiah's mother stood slowly, walking over to the bed where his little sister still slept soundly. Her small body was curled up, her thumb tucked into her mouth, and she looked so peaceful that it almost hurt to look at her. Isaiah's mother stroked her hair softly, her face softening with a tenderness that hadn't been seen in a long time. "She's going to be okay, too," his mother said quietly, as if speaking the words would make them real. "We'll figure this out. We have to." Isaiah watched her carefully, noting the cracks in her resolve. She was trying so hard to be strong, for both him and his sister, but he could see the weariness in her eyes. She had been through so much, endured so much, and now, even though they were finally free from his father's immediate grasp, the road ahead seemed overwhelming. "I don't know what's going to happen next," she continued, her voice faltering slightly. "But we'll take it one step at a time. We'll go to the shelter meetings, we'll talk to the social workers, and we'll find a way to move forward." Isaiah listened, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He wasn't sure how they would move forward. The idea of moving forward felt so vague and distant, like a goal that was too far away to reach. But he nodded anyway, trying to show her that he understood, that he believed in her. The next few days at the shelter passed in a blur. There were intake interviews with social workers, visits from counselors, and endless paperwork. The staff at the shelter were patient and kind, guiding them through each step, but it all felt surreal to Isaiah. He had never been in a place like this before. It was filled with other families, mothers and children who had fled similar situations, seeking safety and a fresh start. There was an unspoken bond between them, a shared understanding of the silent horrors they had endured, but no one talked about it openly. They didn't need to. The bruises, the haunted eyes, the guarded posture, it was all there in the way they moved, the way they avoided eye contact, but offered quiet smiles of solidarity. One evening after dinner, Isaiah sat alone in the small common room of the shelter, staring out the window at the fading light. His mother was in a meeting with one of the counselors, and his sister was playing with some of the other kids in the corner. He should have felt relieved that they were safe, but the fear still gnawed at him. Melinda's words echoed in his mind. "You're brave. You're a hero." He didn't feel brave. He felt like he had been trapped in a nightmare for so long that he didn't know how to live outside of it. Even now, in the safety of the shelter, the memories of his father's anger haunted him. How could he be a hero when he had spent so many years living in fear, too scared to speak up, too scared to protect his mother and sister? As he sat there, lost in thought, one of the shelter staff, a middle-aged woman with a warm smile and kind eyes, approached him. "Isaiah, right?" she asked gently. He nodded, glancing up at her. "I just wanted to check on you," she said, sitting down in the chair beside him. "I know this is all a lot to take in. It's okay if you're feeling a little overwhelmed." Isaiah shrugged, not sure how to respond. Of course, he was overwhelmed. His entire life had been turned upside down in the span of a few hours. He had gone from living in constant fear of his father's wrath to sitting in a shelter, surrounded by strangers, trying to figure out what came next. The woman smiled softly. "You know you're allowed to be scared," she said. "It's okay to not have all the answers right now." Isaiah swallowed hard, his throat tightening. He hadn't cried since the night his father was taken away, but the weight of everything was starting to press down on him. His chest felt tight, and he could feel the tears welling up behind his eyes. "I'm not scared," he muttered, though his voice cracked slightly. The woman didn't push him. She just nodded, her expression understanding. "That's okay, too. But if you ever need to talk, we're here. You're not alone in this." For a long moment, Isaiah didn't say anything. He just stared at the floor, trying to hold back the emotions that were bubbling to the surface. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he whispered, "What if he comes back?" The woman's face softened, and she reached out, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "We won't let that happen," she said firmly. "We'll make sure you and your family are safe. I promise." Isaiah looked up at her, searching her face for any hint of uncertainty, but all he saw was sincerity. He wanted to believe her, wanted to trust that they were finally free from his father's control. But deep down, the fear still lingered, like a shadow that refused to fade. As the evening wore on, and the shelter quieted down for the night, Isaiah lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling. His mother was already asleep in the bed beside him, her breathing soft and steady. His sister had curled up next to her, her small hand resting on their mother's arm. Isaiah closed his eyes, letting out a long, shaky breath. Maybe, just maybe, things would get better. Maybe the fear would eventually fade, and they could start over. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, there was a glimmer of hope. And that, he thought, was a start. The path to healing. Isaiah awoke to the muted hum of voices outside the room, the familiar shelter sounds of people moving about, preparing for the day. His mother and sister were still asleep beside him, their bodies rising and falling in a slow, peaceful rhythm. It was the first time in a long while he could remember seeing them so at ease. But as his eyes adjusted to the dim morning light creeping through the window, the weight of everything they had been through pressed down on him once again. The shelter was supposed to be a refuge, a safe place, but to Isaiah, it still felt temporary, like they were in a limbo between the nightmare they had escaped and the unknown future ahead. He longed for something more permanent, a real home where they could finally start over. Today, they were meeting with one of the counselors again. Isaiah hadn't yet spoken much during the sessions. They always asked him questions, gentle ones about how he was feeling, if he wanted to talk about his father. But he never really knew how to answer. What could he say? That he felt like a balloon tethered to the ground by memories too painful to release. That every time someone mentioned his father, he felt a mixture of anger, fear, and a strange, misplaced guilt. His mother had been doing most of the talking, describing in vague but painful terms what their life had been like. Isaiah sat through the sessions in silence, trying not to think about how much she left unsaid, how she never talked about the worst nights, the nights when the walls seemed to close in, and they had all just huddled in different corners of the house, praying for the storm to pass. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed, careful not to wake them, and crept toward the small bathroom attached to their room. The cold tile floor sent a shiver through him as he stood in front of the mirror. His reflection looked different, older somehow. The bruises from his father's grip had started to fade, but they were still visible enough to remind him of how close they had come to being trapped forever. As he splashed water on his face, a knock at the door startled him. His mother stirred, sitting up groggily. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. "It's just the shelter staff," came the soft reply from the other side of the door. "We wanted to check in before your meeting today." His mother rubbed her eyes and nodded, even though the person couldn't see her. She looked at Isaiah with a small, tired smile. "Go on, honey. I'll get your sister ready." Isaiah nodded and opened the door. A familiar woman stood there, Karen, one of the counselors who had been helping their family since they arrived. She was in her early 40s, with kind eyes that always seemed to see straight through Isaiah's silence. "Good morning," she said warmly. "How are you all doing today?" Isaiah shrugged. "We're fine." Karen smiled at his brief answer but didn't push him to say more. She looked over his shoulder at his mother and sister, who were starting to stir. "I know today's session is going to be tough," she said, addressing both of them. "But we're making real progress. It's important to take these steps, even if they feel small." Isaiah's mother nodded, her expression a mixture of gratitude and weariness. "We're ready," she said, though her voice didn't sound convinced. After a quick breakfast in the shelter's common room, They made their way to the counseling office. Isaiah's little sister, still half asleep, clung to their mother's hand as they walked down the narrow hallway. The office was simple, with 2 comfortable chairs and a small couch, decorated with soft, calming colors. As they settled in, Karen began with her usual gentle questions, asking how everyone was feeling, how the previous night had gone. His mother spoke first, explaining that they had slept better, but that there were still moments when the fear crept back in. Isaiah listened, staring at the floor, feeling detached from the conversation. "I know this is hard for you both," Karen said after his mother finished. "But today, I want to focus on something important, your future. We've talked a lot about the past, about what you've been through, but now it's time to start thinking about what comes next." Isaiah's heart raced at the thought of the future. It felt like too much to think about when he was still processing the events of the past few days. What future could they have, really? Everything felt too fragile, like one wrong step could send them spiraling back into the darkness they had just escaped. Karen must have sensed his hesitation because she turned to him and asked, "Isaiah, what do you want? What do you think your future looks like?" The question hung in the air for a moment, and Isaiah shifted uncomfortably. He didn't know how to answer. He hadn't even allowed himself to think about the future, about school, about friends, about the normal life he had barely glimpsed from a distance while living in his father's shadow. How could he plan for something that seemed so distant, so impossible? "I don't know," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I guess I just want things to be normal." Karen nodded thoughtfully. "That's a good place to start. Normal might look different for you now, but it's possible. We're going to help you find that new normal." Isaiah's mother chimed in, her voice quiet but firm. "We want to move forward, but it's hard. Every day feels like a battle between fear and hope." Karen leaned forward, her hands resting on her knees. "You've been through so much, and the fact that you're even talking about moving forward shows how strong you are. It's not going to be easy, and there will be setbacks, but you're taking the first steps, and you don't have to do it alone." Isaiah stared at his hands, feeling the weight of Karen's words. He wasn't sure if he was ready to move forward. His father's presence still loomed large in his mind, and the thought of rebuilding a life without fear seemed too good to be true. But there was something in Karen's tone, something reassuring, that made him want to try, even if only for his sister's sake. After the session ended, they walked back to the shelter in a contemplative silence. Isaiah's sister, too young to fully grasp the gravity of the day's conversation, skipped ahead, chasing a butterfly that fluttered by. His mother wrapped an arm around his shoulders as they walked. "We'll figure it out, Isaiah," she said softly. "One day at a time." Later that evening, Isaiah found himself standing outside the shelter, the crisp evening air biting at his skin. He could see the other families through the windows, sitting together, talking quietly. For the first time since arriving, he allowed himself to think about what life could be like beyond the shelter walls. Maybe they would find a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood. Maybe his mother would get a job that didn't require her to look over her shoulder, and maybe he and his sister would finally feel safe enough to fall asleep without the fear of waking up to another nightmare. It was a fragile hope, but it was there, small and flickering, like a candle struggling to stay lit in the wind. As Isaiah looked up at the darkening sky, he realized that, for the first time in a long time, the future didn't seem as terrifying as it once had. The path to healing would be long, and there would be scars that might never fully fade. But standing there, in the quiet evening, Isaiah took a deep breath and felt the weight on his chest loosen, just a little. And that was enough for now.